Iran,
and
the
that's what
IRGC has the guns, and they're arresting and torturing people who
we're
celebrate
bombing the IRGC.
I know, but you can't tell people to rise up and then not support them because you're sending them to the slaughter, and that's a terrible thing to do.
Yeah, but there's no precedent.
Revolution
That wasn't the U.S. coming in and bombing military action producing that result.
And it took 7 years, but you had this transition to democracy, and you see this
happening
happening
in Venezuela.
That was an internal
process. That's totally different from the U.S. coming in and bombing a country.
One. Number two, the president did release 2 statements over the weekend. Number 3, the Congress, I think, is going to debate
social media
and vote. So, is that?
Yeah, I mean,
is that a problem?
Look, I think.
Now, if you haven't been paying attention, one of the things that you'll see is that the Donald Trump administration are scrambling and struggling to try and justify the reason as to why they entered into an illegal war with Iran. And in this clip, we're going to see Abby Phillip and Scott Jennings clash on the justifications that this administration are giving as to why they went into Iran. As usual, let's watch the clip in full. I will briefly give a bit of my perspective in the middle, but I'm going to save it majority towards the end. Let's not waste any time. Let's get into it.
And we may have casualties. That often happens in war.
I don't know if this is technically a war.
We didn't start this war, but under President Trump, we are finishing it.
This isn't a war. We haven't declared war.
The Secretary of Defense, who calls himself the Secretary of War, said today this is a war.
We set the terms of this war, from start to finish.
Nobody should classify this as war. It is combat operations.
War is hell, and always will be.
Strategic strikes are not war.
I guess the Congress people that you saw in that clip are all convinced that it's not a war because that would mean that they would have had to have done their job beforehand to authorize this. But it does seem like we're in a war because we're talking 4 to 5 weeks, and we took out the leader of a nation.
Yeah, when you're dropping bombs on a country and killing their leader, you are at war. And of course, Iran is hitting back. So obviously we are at war. I mean, there's just so many dumb talking points going around about what's going on there. Clearly we're at war, and one of the troubling things about this conflict, I think, is the fact that President Trump made no effort to explain to Congress or the American people why we're going to war, or to build a case for the war, which was supported by only 20% of the public to begin with. There is no congressional authorization. Now you can argue there have been plenty of uses of force in the past where presidents have used force without congressional authorization. But in this case, there was no time element. There was no imminent threat, as we've established. This is a war of regime change. At least it's sold that way sometimes by the administration. This is the kind of thing where clearly the American people and the American elected representatives should have had a chance to weigh in, and they haven't. Now, all that said, Abby, I would add, that doesn't, even though I think the war was unwarranted, I think it's unauthorized, that doesn't mean it's going to be a disaster. There could still be positive benefits that come out of it. At the very least, I think it will degrade the Iranian threat. At the very least, Iran will emerge much weaker, much less of a menace to its neighbors. That doesn't mean I believe it's going to become a Jeffersonian democracy. I'm not sure that you're going to find an Iranian Delcy Rodriguez, but the Iranian threat will probably be a good deal less after this conflict than before. But nevertheless, I would say after Iraq, we should all be fairly wary of starting preventative wars based on nebulous intelligence with a goal of regime change.
You bring up Iraq, though, but even Iraq, the process was actually dramatically more transparent. President Bush went to the UN in 2002. Congress authorized Bush to use force in October 2002. The president addressed the nation in March 2003 and formed a coalition of the willing of dozens of countries before going into this. Right now, we are in this with Israel. The president has yet to speak to really address the nation on this topic since this war started.
Well, the Gulf states are with us, and we have lots of allies with supportive statements. We are in it militarily with Israel. There are some indications that some of the Gulf states that Iran has been attacking may join in, and so we'll see what happens.
They're defending themselves right now.
Yeah, and they should.
But in terms of the coalition,
but they support what the United States is doing. Is the point? Okay. So we're not just here with Israel and without any other political support or rhetorical support. That's number one. Number two, the president did release 2 statements over the weekend. Number 3, the Congress, I think, is going to debate
on social media
and vote. So is that?
Yeah, I mean,
is that a problem?
Look, I think it is a problem that the president hasn't gone, he hasn't given a press conference. He hasn't, he hasn't really laid out fully what the strategy is. He's given probably over a dozen interviews over the last 2 days. And he's said contradictory things in almost every single interview. So there is a missing piece. What is contradictory? Contradictory is saying one thing in one interview and another.
No, give me an example. I mean,
he said, we want regime change, we don't want regime change. He said, we know the people that were going to replace the Ayatollah. Then he said, we killed the people who replaced the Ayatollah, so we don't know them. He said, we want the people of Iran to rise up and free themselves and fight the regime. And then he said, we're happy to work with the regime remnants if somebody emerges from the rubble.
He said that this could be over in 2 days,
He said it
and then
could be
the
over
next
in
day
5
he
weeks.
said it would
He said it could be over in 2 days.
3 to 4 weeks.
Yes, he literally said every single option.
Here's the point. Here's the point.
It's a total mess.
There's been contradictory statements, not just from the president, but from the Secretary of State, from the Vice President, from the Secretary of Defense about what the objectives really were here and why the American people should support this. And I just would ask, if we are going to be in a 4-week or longer conflict, even if it's 4 days, why not go to the American people and get the vote? If this is popular, if this is supported, get the vote.
Well, look, presidents have to make national security decisions based on what they think is in the best interests of the nation in that moment. And that's what the president has done here. I agree with you that I think the president and the administration do need to lay out for the American people, continue to lay out, are we meeting our objectives? I feel like they're doing that. Look, the clear objectives, and this has been consistent, we're not going to let them have the missiles. We're not going to let them have nuclear weapons. Those are the clear military objectives. We've also sunk some of their Navy, which has also been a trouble there. That they've given us trouble and other nations trouble. But the missiles and the nuclear weapons has been a consistent argument of this administration. Now, if taking out this leadership gets to people eventually who would say, okay, we won't do the missiles and we won't do nuclear weapons, that is an amazing outcome, not just for us, but for the entire region. And that's why the region is supporting us.
I was reading some writings from, I think it's a University of Chicago scholar who studies airstrikes. He teaches Robert Pape. He teaches to the Air Force about not only the history of airstrikes, but also tactics. And he made a very simple point. There is zero precedent for airstrikes producing political change in the history of this country being a military force around the world. And on top of that, he argues that what it might actually produce instead, what it often produces instead, is actually a more hard-lined nationalist, political force within the country. So as we talk about all of this, I think there are a lot of experts out there who study this stuff pretty closely and work with the United States military who don't see any precedent for saying, oh, they're going to come out of this more moderate than they were before. They're going to abandon their ambitions to strike back against the countries that are attacking them. That seems relevant.
Of course. And you don't.
And just really, really quick, I need your guys' help here. This is probably where a bit of the confused in my name comes from. The thing that I don't understand when, it's always America, when they go into these countries and they take out a leader and they strike the country, kind of similar as well with what Israel done with Gaza. Kind of similar to what Abby just said. In my opinion, all they're going to do is radicalize the next generation. And they're going to basically give more justification as to why the previous generation was the way that they were. Because you got to think, children coming up now that have lost their mum, their dad, their little sister, their little brother, auntie, uncle, grandma, granddad, they're now going to want revenge. So surely down the line, all that's going to do is just create a new wave, but they're going to come back stronger, more radicalized and more aggressive. Let me know in the comment section if what I'm saying makes sense. And if you've got an answer to that, I'd really love to hear it. I will be checking it out. But let's get back to the video.
You don't have to be a military expert to understand what's going on here. If we couldn't influence the path of a country's regime change with hundreds of thousands of troops, we definitely can't do it with zero troops and zero partners on the ground. And we tried this several times in the last 30 or 40 years, and it always failed with hundreds of thousands of people that we put in harm's way. And now we're trying to do it on the cheap with 0 people on the ground and 0 partners. And of course, it's not going to work, And so we're basically breaking it and then just hoping that everything goes well. And again, you don't have to be an expert to understand why that's a very high risk, very low reward type of proposition.
Or at least
and what you're doing is you're
temporary.
plunging this country into a disaster that you have no means and no intention of helping them out of. And all of those possibilities are bad. They could have a civil war. There could be uprisings that get crushed. People talk about the 2002 invasion or 2003 invasion of Iraq. I think it's more akin to the 1991 invasion of Iraq, where we encouraged the Kurds and the Shia to rise up, and then we didn't give them any support, and they got mowed down, and they got crushed. And that's what we're setting the Iranian people up for, and it's not okay. It's not okay for them. It's not okay for us.
Max, you were saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I don't think that there is much of a strategy, and you can see President Trump and his senior officials basically throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, both in terms of a justification for the war as well as an instate for the war. And basically, I think this is the way that President Trump operates. He wants to keep all his options on the table. So whatever happens, he can claim this is the greatest victory of all time, that whatever happens, he'll claim it was part of his plan all along. But it's very unclear right now what is going to happen. I think it's extremely nebulous. And I think, as Josh said earlier, if you don't know exactly what objective you're trying to achieve, how on earth are you going to achieve it?
Can I add something here? The first is that on the communications point, I actually believe it's a deliberate effort to obfuscate on the part of the Trump administration. Yes, there are contradictory statements. That's because they're dealing with an adversary, and they know that adversaries are listening very closely. It doesn't work very well in a democracy. I understand that. There's a reason why we have the press holding our government and authority accountable, and I understand that as well. However, when this administration believes that they don't want us to know which way they're going, it doesn't mean that they don't have a plan on the inside. It doesn't mean that they don't know their goals. It means that they don't want you to know where it's going.
But can I ask you, I mean, what would be the point?
I'm skeptical.
Yeah,
What would be the, I just, but no, no, no. But hold on, I just want to understand, what would be the, what would be the point?
They have no idea what they're doing. There's no 4D chess.
Hold on,
There's no 4D chess.
let me just ask you a follow-up.
I don't think it's 4D chess.
What would be the point at this stage? We're in the middle of bombing them into smithereens. What would be the point of sending, contradictory messages about the objectives of the strike? What are they trying to get out of the Iranians by doing that?
Because for an adversary, if you know where the U.S. red line is, if you know the U.S. where they're moving next, then you're going to always be a step ahead, and you're going to know, okay, well, I could go this far.
But I don't understand. I think the part I'm not understanding is that we are already bombing them. We are already destroying. We're killing them. We are destroying their munitions. We are destroying their navy. So they're not worried about. We've already crossed the red line threshold here. So I just don't understand. What are we trying to get them to? What are we trying to get them to do, I guess, is the question.
Well, in general, if you don't know, if they don't know what the U.S. is doing next, or how far the United States is willing to go, then they're going to be on their back heels, right? They don't, and you're already seeing it. Why is it that they targeted the Gulf first? It's because, on one hand, because they're terrorists, and that's a terrorist tactic to pressure the Gulfies, thinking that the U.S. and Israel are going to stop it. It's because they don't want to engage in a direct conflict with the United States and Israel, because again, they're not sure how far are we going to go. Trump appears erratic.
Boots on the ground?
Maybe Trump presses the nuclear button.
They sent thousands of missiles into Israel,
and
so I think they did engage.
I think that
are you talking about boots on the ground?
Well, we don't know. That's for an example. Let me give you an example from my.
Embassy in
Let me
Saudi
give you an
Arabia.
example from.
Let
me give you an example, Josh, from my time in government when I handled the Syria war, and things were getting worse, and we were getting a lot of pressure. And Obama wanted to go out there and say there is no way we were going to militarily intervene. And I was at the White House saying that was a terrible idea because Assad would hear that and view that as a carte blanche. And what happened? He went out and said we would never militarily intervene. And it was literally the next day there was a marked increase in violence. This is how adversaries work. And I want to just add one quick point on precedent, because one of the fascinating things I see here that the administration is grappling with is that they clearly want to see regime change in Iran, in Venezuela, or transitions of some kind. And they're testing the waters. And there is precedent for transitions to democracy from dictatorship that took a long period of time where you ousted a leader but worked with the regime. And that was what happened in Spain.
As a result of airstrikes?
Well,
There's no
but
precedent for that. There's no precedent for that.
In Spain, the leader was ousted. Economic incentives were given to the existing
no
That was an
precedent.
internal revolution in Spain. That wasn't the U.S. coming in and bombing.
Military action
incentives were
producing
given
that
outside.
result.
And it took 7 years, but you had this transition to democracy, and you see this
That was an
happening in
internal
Venezuela.
process. That's totally different from the U.S. coming in and bombing a country.
But they are studying.
Wouldn't you hope that there is an internal uprising in Iran where the people who you admit, everybody admits, have been massacred and suppressed and terrorized and tortured?
I mean,
if they take back their country and it's not hostile to the West,
we're all in favor of that.
we're the ones with the guns, and we're the ones with the airplanes.
In
And that's
Iran,
what
the
we're doing.
IRGC has the guns, and they're arresting and torturing people who
We're
celebrate
bombing the IRGC.
I know, but you can't tell
All
people
right.
to rise up and then not support them because you're sending them to the slaughter, and that's a terrible thing to do.
We actually will have an opportunity to continue this conversation a little bit later. But next for us, he promised no.
I mean, even now, I'm going to be 100% honest with you guys. I'm over here in the UK. You guys have probably seen our Prime Minister done a bit of a U-turn in terms of helping out the United States with air bases. I still don't understand why America went into Iran. I mean, look, I spend a lot of time on YouTube. I watch a lot of videos on YouTube, and there are talks of things around Israel and Israel wanting to do it because they want to increase their borders. I'm not sure though, and I'm not going to act like I know, but the thing that I do know is this: there'd be a lot more clarity and a lot more understanding if the Trump administration would come out, number one, keep all of their messaging consistent so different people aren't saying two different things, but then number two, if Donald Trump held a press conference and he took questions and clearly laid out the reasoning and made the case for why they've gone into Iran. Because the reality is, as it stands right now, it just looks like, number one, this is a rogue administration. We've already seen that they're willing to push the boundaries and go above and beyond the law to be able to achieve their objectives. So it's not too far out of sight, out of reach, to believe that they wouldn't do the exact same thing when it comes to going into Iran. So I'm just not sure exactly how they have justified this. But it's just ironic to see Scott Jennings once again willing to try and justify the reasoning behind it when, like we said, we don't have a clue. You know, we heard about the nuclear ambitions that Iran supposedly had, but we were also told that last year Donald Trump informed us and the world that they completely obliterated their nuclear program. So what do we believe? Who do we believe? Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comment section below, and do me a favor, hit the thumbs up button purely for the YouTube algorithm. And also hit subscribe if you're interested in a perspective and commentary from somebody who's on the outside looking in to American politics, a Brit that lives over the pond. Appreciate you guys. I'll see you guys in the next clip.